All right, everybody, it's a couple minutes after 3 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Liz. I work with Tonal Software, and hopefully you are here today for a webinar all about how to use perfect black and white and how to hone in your black and white editing skills. So a quick recap before we start. I'm going to be working mostly in Lightroom, but I will open up Photoshop just to kind of show you how to access the suite through Photoshop. And I'll be going into perfect layers and perfect black and white. And I'll be talking a little bit about both of the programs, but most of it is going to be focused on photo editing and then perfect black and white. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to ask those in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel. I will be saving most of the questions for the end of the webinar. There's a lot of people in here, and going through those questions can get pretty tiring when you're trying to go back and forth between showing you guys what to do and answering them. So save those questions, ask those towards the end. I'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes or so just for answering. All right, so let's go ahead and start. I'm here inside of Lightroom right now, and I've got a catalog open of a whole bunch of photos that I like to use for editing here. And let me make it a little bit smaller so you can see what I've got here. Now, when you're going through portrait editing, when you're going through portrait editing, and then when you're going through landscape editing, it's going to be pretty much the same. You're going to open up your files from your computer. You're going to download them to pretty much whatever program you like to use. And I typically load my photos into Lightroom. That's how I like to start. You know, you go out, you take a whole bunch of photos. I was up in Seattle a couple months ago, and I took a whole bunch of photos of the landscape with my friend, and I loaded them all up into Lightroom. And typically, I go through the ones that I know I really like the most, and then I choose the ones that I'm going to want to edit. So I highlighted two that I really, really liked using the star system inside of Lightroom. And if you're using Bridge through Photoshop, they also have a star program, as does Aperture. So starring my images typically helps me figure out the ones that I know I really want to edit. So that's usually my first step. If you're working with the standalone program, you can actually highlight photos on your computer using labels and tags. So that can also be a way to do it. But once you have the photos that you know you want, what I usually suggest is when you've got an image, I took this at night up in Seattle, and when you find an image that you really like and you know you want to edit, I always suggest that you do some basic edits here inside of Lightroom. So a little bit of exposure, maybe adding in a little bit of clarity, and editing a couple of other things like noise reduction. Those are all things you're going to want to do here in Lightroom. So if I swap over to the Develop module, we'll pop over here. I haven't really made any changes to this image. This is straight out of my camera. So there's pretty much nothing that I've done to this. And I may want to go through and edit a couple of things, like I may want to lower the highlights down just a little bit and see how much more information I can get in some of these brighter city lights here. So I can take my highlights slider and move it over to the right just a tad. I can also take my shadow slider and pump that up a little bit, and I can see if I can pull out a little bit more information in some of the shadows here in the hills. So I'm doing really simple editing inside of Lightroom, and that's what it's great for if you use Lightroom, but also if you use Aperture as well, you can do a lot of your basic edits using the adjustment panel in Aperture. So both work in a pretty similar way, and you have access to this kind of very simple panel system. So the only other thing that I would do here is I'm editing my exposure, making sure it looks pretty good. I may add a little tiny bit of clarity to pump up some of the edge contrast. And then I'll probably want to go down into my noise reduction area. If you need to do any form of noise reduction, you always want to do that here in Lightroom or Aperture. And you want to make sure you do it before you do any of your excess editing. If you add some sort of filter that highlights detail in an image, it's also going to highlight a lot of the noise in your image. So by reducing it, you're saving yourself a step and you're saving yourself a lot of headache later. Now, this image was shot at an ISO of 200, so I don't really need to worry about the fact that I have a lot of noise in here. There isn't that much. So once I'm all set to go, Then we'll go ahead and I want to get ready to put it into black and white. Now there are two different ways that I can do that. I think this is a PSD file. Let me go back to my library and check. So I take a lot of my images and I swap them over to PSDs to make it a little bit easier to get them in and out of the suite. But if you're working with a raw image, it'll work in a very similar way. But there are two different ways that I can get to perfect black and white. I can right click on my image and go to edit in and choose perfect black and white from there. Now inside of Lightroom, I like this option a lot more. And the reason why is when I go ahead and click on it, it opens up this dialog box. And this is really, really, really important for your entire editing workflow because it always makes sure that you have the option of editing a copy of your image with any Lightroom adjustments that you may have made. So I went in and I changed a couple of things in my develop module. And I don't want to edit my original image. I always want to edit a copy of my image. Plus, it also gives you the option of choosing what file type you want your second duplicated image to be. And that's always really, really useful. So I want to make sure that I have a PSD file. I want the resolution to be all the way up to 300. I want to make sure that I save my color space as Adobe RGB 1998. And once I've opened up my file options, that's when I'll go ahead and click edit. And then you'll see right away that it creates a copy inside my Lightroom catalog, and then it pops that copy into black and white. Now, once inside perfect black and white, we'll go over some quick basics. On the left-hand side, you've got your effect library. So this is where we're going to feed the different categories that you have access to. We've separated them down into pretty basic categories. So we've got 19th century processes, which are a whole bunch of old school film style, very nostalgic looks. We've got a section that's 20th century classic silver, which is silver gelatin style prints. We have a hint of color category, which allows you to bring back some of the color in your original image, which is really cool. And then my other favorite is called Hollywood Portrait. And a lot of these presets hark back to some of the old 20s, 30s, 40s black and white images. And these can be a lot of fun to play around with when you've got portraits. So for this image, I want to go to one of the more landscape-driven categories. So I'm going to start out in the 20th century classic silver, and we'll go ahead and open that up. And then I will go ahead and just scroll through, and you'll see I've got a whole bunch of nice big previews of what these presets are going to look like. But one of the cool things that came out with Photo Suite 7.5, our newest update, is actually the Quick View browser. And it's the little icon to the right of each category. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and it opens up a full screen browser view of all of the different presets in that category. So I can go through and I can actually take a look at these, and I've got nice large previews. I can actually make them bigger with the slider on the bottom left-hand corner, and I can go through and I can maybe find one that works. So low contrast is definitely not going to work. I don't really like this over a barrel. It's not the style that I'm looking for. And I don't really like any of the colored ones. I want to keep that tone pretty classic. I want to keep it monotone. And this is a style that I really like, that very, very simplistic, white, black, no tonal adjustments whatsoever. I really, really like that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start out with, we'll start out with one called Dark and Gritty, and we'll take a look and see how that is. I'll just click on it and it applies it to my image. And it's not exactly what I'm looking for with this photo. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to try out another preset. And one of the great things about working in black and white is these presets are very, very easy to scroll through very quickly. So I can go over to the 20th century modern digital and I can take a look at some of these in here as well. So you always have the option of clicking through a lot of these presets. Sometimes people go to a category and they don't see anything they like. We've got a whole bunch of categories here that you can use, and that's really great. So I'm going to scroll through and I'll go ahead and select the Modern Straight. It seems very simple, but also very straightforward, which I really like. And it brings out all of the detail and all the city lights down here in the bottom of my image, and I like that. Now, once I've chosen a preset that works for me, I'll go ahead and save it as a favorite by clicking the flag icon on the bottom right-hand corner. So now it'll be popped into my favorites library. So the next time that I come into the program, I know that these are my favorite presets. These are the ones that I use all the time. You'll see I've got a daguerreotype that's down here, which is one of my favorites. Ingrid Cool, which is a portrait preset. So I put all my favorites here so I know where they are. And now that I want to do some more bulk editing to this image, I want to click on the bar that's in between my effects library and my preview here on the right hand side. You'll see it's right in the middle of the two, and I'll just go ahead and click on it once and it hides my effect library. And this can be really useful so that you're not paying attention. You've got a closer to a large full screen view. So now that I've got my preset on my image, I can go in and I can make a couple extra edits here. And we'll go ahead and start on the right-hand side. We've got a whole bunch of different panes here, and I'll walk through each one of these using multiple images. So I'm only going to use a couple for this photo, and we'll move on and use a couple more for the next photo. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that my tonal range is exactly what I want it. And right now it looks like it's pretty close to where I want it to be. I'm going to go ahead and take my brightness slider and move it over to the right just a tad. Not too much, but just enough to kind of pump up some of the lightness. I'll also take my contrast slider and move that over to the right. I want to pump up that contrast and get some of those blacks to be a little bit more intense. I've got a detail slider down here, which I'm going to go ahead and pump up just a little bit more. And detail is kind of like a child of sharpening and clarity. It does a little bit of each at the same time, which is really, really nice. So it goes in and it pays attention to the edges in your image, all of those little tiny edges between the pixels that you want to emphasize. The detail slider goes in and tries to help do that. Now, you always have the option of going in and adding more detail to select areas in your image with the detail brush. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but for this image, I actually like the way it looks with that huge overall detail on the entire photo. It looks really crisp, so we want to keep that there. Now, underneath is the color response pane, and this responds to the original color information in your image. So your original photo and all of that RGB information that was saved is still there. So you can turn your preview on and off by pressing Control P on a Mac or Control P on a PC or Command P on a Mac. And your original image shows up in color. So this is what my photo actually looked like. It's got kind of like weird purplish sky in the background. And then right down at the bottom, you've got all these really bright yellow city lights. And you've got a couple of other strange colors in here, but for the most part, we've got kind of a yellow thing on the bottom and then kind of this purpley thing up on top. So knowing that allows you to access all of those different color sliders. So you can lighten and darken each one of the color channels in your photo. So I'll take the yellow slider, and if I move it over to the right, all of those city lights down on the bottom start to pop up. And if I move it over to the left, they completely darken. So I actually want to pump those yellows up just a little bit to really make those really nice flashing lights down at the bottom. I really want to make those pop out. So using this color response pane can be really, really useful because you selectively choose which parts of your photo you want to go in and edit. Now, I can play around with a couple of these other colors here. You'll see that the blue slider is just affecting a couple of the blue lights down in the bottom of the image, particularly that little W that's right on top of the crane right there. So just playing around with these can be really useful, and sometimes you don't really know what color it's going to be, so you can just click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Now, underneath, we're going to keep on going. We're not going to use the glow pane for this image or the film grain for this image. We're going to leave the toner out of this photo. The next thing we want to talk about is the vignette. And adding vignettes can be really great. It doesn't come with the preset that I applied, but for this image, I want to apply something that kind of darkens a little bit more around the bottom corners and the top corners here. And I'll go ahead and turn that pane on. And it's just an on and off button that's right up here on the top right-hand side of each one of these panes. And you always have the option of turning on and off any of these panes. So I can edit things like the brightness here, so I can actually lighten or darken depending on what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and darken a little bit. And one of the really great ways to tell what parts of your image are being affected buy a vignette is by editing, oh, I closed it by accident, by editing the feathering amount. And this is something that is a trick that I like to use when I'm making vignettes, because a lot of times I look at it and I'm trying to figure out what size it is and what part of my image it's affecting, and I always get really frustrated. So if I take my feather amount and I move it all the way down to 0, you can actually see the hard edge of that vignette, and you can pay a little bit closer attention between which parts of your image will be affected. So if I drop my feathering amount down, I can change the roundness, which is what I'm going to do. I just want a little bit of darkness on the corners right there. And then I can also edit the size here as well. So if I just want those corners to be darkened just a little bit, I can go in and do that. And now I'll just take my feather up a little bit, and I've got that really soft darkness on each one of these corners, and it just kind of pulls in a little bit on the edges. I like that it gives you kind of that old school film style look, which I'm always going for. And there we go. So it's not a huge difference, but my before is right here without a vignette, and here's my after, and it just kind of darkens up a little bit on the corners, and it pulls everything in just a tad. Now, underneath is the, go ahead and close the vignette pane. Underneath is the border pane. And again, I can turn that on to add a border if I want to. And I can select a category of border that I want. So we'll go down to, say, go down a little bit more, and we'll go to film. And once I select the film category, I can choose the type of border from the border drop-down menu. And let's see, I can try out any of these if I want. So we'll do medium format thin here, and it pops up, and it's just a very simple black border. I can also go to one of the old instant borders. We've got instant 1 and then instant 2, so they're just a little bit different. I like instant 2. So if I really want to give it that kind of film style look, I can go ahead and choose a border. And then what's really cool about these borders is you can also change the blending mode if you want. So right now it's set to normal. It's just flat across your image, and that's it. But if you go down to something like overlay or soft light, it blends into your photo a little bit, and it gives kind of a grungy style to it. You can also do something called hard light, and with the film inspired, the instant borders, the hard light actually looks really cool because it's got this super grungy edge to it. Now, what's even better about these borders is you can also change the size and the opacity. So if it's a little too strong, you can lessen the effect and it blends into your image a little bit more. And then you can also edit the size. So if it's a little too close to the center of your image, you can actually just kind of pull it out. And then I can cut off some of the excess grunge, but I still have some of these little like light leaks right along the edge of my image. So you can play around with the sizes and the opacity and the blending mode of these borders. So play around with that because sometimes it changes how you use a border and how you view it. Typically I don't add borders, but the ones that I do, I like to lower the opacity and have them blend into my photo a little bit better. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do is I can go in and I can add a little bit of sharpening. So if this image is going to be something that I'm going to print, I may want to go in and add a little bit of sharpening. Now, typically what I do is unless I know this image is going to be printed, I turn my sharpening off, and I don't do that until I get ready to print. So I like to prep my image and get it ready to go beforehand. And then when I decide that I want to print it, I actually create a duplicate that has sharpening on it. And that's something that I do. I always have my original image, my edited image, and then my print ready sharpened image. And that's a workflow that I typically like to stick by, particularly for black and white photos, or any of the photos that I edit in effects. Either of those, I never like to add sharpening unless I create a duplicate. And that makes sure that I always have a separate print copy. So if I want to go back to my black and white image, I can go and re-edit it for whatever reason. Now, inside Perfect Black and White, I'm going to go ahead and turn my sharpening off for this photo. I don't necessarily need it. Now you'll notice that it does become a little less sharp, and if you do want it to have a little bit more of an intense detail and sharpness down at the bottom, that's when you can go in and use some of the brush tools that we have. And my favorite is called the detail brush. And it's exactly what the detail slider is doing. It's adding a little bit of sharpness and clarity to some of the edges in your image. However, you can selectively choose where. And I like that a little bit more. So I'll go ahead and choose my detail brush. And you can use the Perfect brush, which is the edge detection brush. And we'll just make my brush a little bit bigger. I'll keep my amount at about 20. And I'll just go in and start clicking and dragging over some of the buildings and the lights down here. And it's just kind of pumping up some of the detail along these edges. And you can click and use it a couple of times. So I'm clicking and dragging. This is my third click and drag. So I'm really, really pumping up that detail down there. So it's starting to look really crisp. And one of the great things is when you're looking at images on the web, if I am going to be placing this up on the web, for the most part, people can't tell if you add a little extra detail. You're not going to see that pixelization in your image on the web, which is really great. When you print it, sometimes I suggest going down just a notch on the detail, because sometimes people have a tendency to go overboard and then they print it out and you can see everything in your entire image, especially if you're looking at it at a 16 by 20 or 17 by 22 print. So go light with the detail if you're getting your image ready for print, but if you're going onto the web, usually you're perfectly fine. Pump up that detail and it usually looks pretty good. Now, for this image, I can also go in and add a little bit of detail to some of these star trails that we got and some of these plane trails and stars. There we go. So we've got these kind of cool plane trails that were happening when we were there. And I want to go in and kind of pump up some of the details so that you can really see those as well. Now, the last thing that I may want to do with this image is I can take my brightness brush and I can brighten up this part on the right. For some reason, this was a little bit darker than the area that's right by the Space Needle. And the Space Needle is a pretty big area inside Seattle. So if you've ever been to Seattle, it's a pretty bustling spot of town. So that whole area around there has a lot of lights. Whereas if you go up over to the right over here, a lot of times that's a little bit quieter. It's a little bit more residential. So we were out at, I think 11:30 or midnight, and things were starting to turn off, but the Space Needle was still, booming. So I want to lighten up just a little bit on the right-hand side. So I've got my brightness brush selected, and I'll set my mode to lighten because I want to lighten up that area. And I'm going to lower my amount a little bit because I don't want to go overboard. So I'll go all the way down to 10, and then I'll just kind of slowly click and drag over this area on the hill. Now, if you want to turn the brightness brush, the Perfect brush off, sometimes that can be a really good way to kind of get a little bit more brightness in one area. But I'm going to go in and we'll just brighten that up. And it's not a huge difference, but it's just enough that I can tell the difference. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you about as far as the brushes go is we're going to lighten and darken in a whole bunch of areas that we don't like. We're just going to lighten up here, and let's say you go overboard with a brush and you lighten way too much. I've lightened so much over here on the right-hand side, and I don't like it at all. If you go up to the Edit menu, you have an Undo button, and you always have this Undo button with any of the brush changes that you make. So if I don't like any of those changes, I can just press Command-C until I go back to whatever changes I really liked. And you can go back quite a ways. I've never had a problem where it stops and it doesn't let me go back. You also have the option of resetting your entire brush. So if you just want to start from scratch, which sometimes is really nice because you go overboard and then you're like, I don't even want to look at it anymore. You can always reset your brightness brush and just start from the beginning. And this can be a really great way to just kind of restart all of your burning and dodging in an image. I have a tendency to burn and dodge a little too much, and then I look at it afterwards and I'm like, oh geez, what did I do? So I always like to go and reset my brush and kind of start again. So we'll set it back to lighten, and then we'll just click and drag again. And we'll brighten up some of that area on the right-hand side. And that's looking a little bit better, and I didn't go overboard into my sky by accident. It's just brightening up a little bit there. Now, once I'm finished and I've made all of my changes, there are a whole bunch of things that I've done to this preset that has been very specific to this image. I've edited things in almost all of the panes, or at least changed most of the panes. So I added a vignette, I added a border, I took off the sharpening, I changed a whole bunch in the color response pane and the tone pane. So that's a lot of things that I changed to this preset. So I want to be able to save this so I can reuse it again with another image. And there were 2 photos that I took in Seattle at the time, and I want to add the exact same preset to that other image. So if I go up to my preset menu, I can save this as a preset. So we can give it a name. We'll call it Seattle Night. We'll call it Seattle Night Urban Landscape. And I can place it in a category. So we've got a whole bunch of categories here. I've got some from other people. I've got some that are specific for portrait and weddings. I have my landscape presets here, so that's what I'm going to place that in. Type in a descriptor, creator, and we'll go ahead and click on create. Now let me pop back open the effects library here and go over to my presets category. And you'll see here's Liz's landscape presets. We'll pop that open. And here's Liz's awesome and rad landscape preset, which was for another style of landscape that I edited. And then here's my Seattle Night Urban Landscape preset. So I've got both of them right here, and I can reuse these again if I want to. So that's a really, really great way to go in and make sure that your images look consistent. A lot of times I notice that photographers will take, they've got 10 photos that they want to edit from one photo shoot, and they want them all to look pretty similar. They want to all add the same effects to it, except when they finally look at them after they've gone through and added those different effects, whether it be black and white or color. A lot of times you'll notice little differences between them. You'll notice that they added a larger vignette on this photo, and then they went in and that image has a lot more detail and a lot more contrast than that one, and that one has a toner to it. This is a good way to keep your images consistent. If you've got a lot of photos and you want to go through and make them look like they were all shot at the same time, presets are definitely the way to do that. So let me go ahead and click apply, and it'll take just a second for it to go back into Lightroom, and it'll save that image. And now inside of Lightroom, you'll see I have a stack with my original image here and then my black and white photo here. So I've got 2 different images that were taken, 2 different images. They're the exact same thing, but I've saved my original if I ever want to re-edit edit this if I want to. So the perspective is a little off on this photo, so I may want to go in and re-edit the perspective and then re-add the preset if I wanted to. So I can go in and I can do that if I want to. Now, what's really cool about this is I was just talking about how it's really great to have consistency between your images. So this is another image that was taken in a different spot in Seattle. And if I wanted to apply the same preset to it, I can do that. So I can either go back into black and white and reapply that preset, or I can go up to the File menu and choose Export. And inside the Export menu, this processes your images through the photo suite if you want to. So if I go to the Export To menu and go down to Perfect Black and White, I can choose a category, and you'll see these are all of the categories that are in the effects library, and then these are all of the preset categories that I've created. So here's Liz's landscape presets. I'll select Seattle Night Urban Landscape. I want to export it to the same folder as the original image. So I want to make sure that they're basically just side by side. And then I want to add it to this catalog, and I want to add it to the same stack as my original image. And if I want to, I can rename it, which I don't really need to do. We'll call it Seattle Black and White. I can select the file type setting, so I want to make sure it's a PSD file, and I can change bit depth, color space. And then if I want to, I can also resize it, which I don't need to do. So once I go ahead and click export, what it's going to do is it's going to take that image, pop it into black and white, and it's going to do all of this automated for you. So it's going to apply a preset for you, make all of those changes. It's going to save that image into the folder that I want, and then it's going to put it back into Lightroom. So it did this all in less than like 10 seconds. So here is my Seattle night urban landscape preset that I just created on my other Seattle image. Now, this again is a really cool way of working inside Lightroom and the photo suite. You have batch processing allowed in Aperture as well, and you also can do quick preset edits inside of Photoshop. And I'll go ahead and I'll show you how to do that. So let me go back to my grid here. And we're going to go through and we're going to edit another photo so I can show you guys kind of a different styling that you can add to your images. So I have this photo here, and I want to apply kind of an old school, I'm trying to think, like kind of an old school glowy 1930s actress portrait. You see, there's some of my favorite images when they have that really like soft glow on the images, and everyone just looks so nice, and you can still see that they have a lot of detail in some of the select areas of the image, but the entire thing itself just always looks so luscious because all the tones are just, they're so soft. So I want to create this kind of like Hollywood style portrait for this client, and I want to make sure that it's consistent with a whole bunch of other images that I may have to edit of her and maybe some of her friends that were taken on the same day. So let me pop over to Photoshop and I'll kind of walk you through how to do a similar process through Photoshop. All right, so we'll go into, I'm going to take my images off of my desktop here, and we'll go through and we'll open up my images here. So here's one image, and we'll open up all three of them here. They're all taken on the same day. We'll pop them into Photoshop, and I'll walk you through how to do that here. So once I've got my image open inside Photoshop, on the right-hand side, you'll notice that I have an on one pane that's open. And this panel or pane is automatically opens when you load the suite and you open up Photoshop. This should automatically show up. If you don't see it, you can go to the window menu and go down to extensions, and you'll see the on one name right there. And as long as you check it, this panel will pop up. And here you'll see perfect black and white. And what's really, really cool about using Photoshop, and this is something that I really like, is you'll see these are all of my preset categories here. These are all the presets that I've created. So here's Liz's landscape presets, and then here are the two that I've made. You can automate adding a preset to your image the way that we just did inside Lightroom by double-clicking one of these. And I'm not going to do that because I want to create a new preset for this image. But inside this pane, I've got perfect black and white selected. All I need to do is double click, open perfect black and white, and it'll pop me over to the suite. There we go. So we'll start out in the effects library. And for this image, we're going to go completely different route. So if I want to, let's go ahead and start out in the hint of color category, so I can show you guys this one. And this category is really, really fun to play around with. If you want to retain some of the original color from your image and you want to add kind of a softer, more desaturated style, you can go in and do that. And one of my favorites is called Vintage Glow Dark. Vintage Glow Light works really well for images that are a little bit darker, but this image is already really light, so I don't need to worry about it. But it adds this really cool, like soft, fuzzy hue, and it really reminds me of, I don't know, it reminds me kind of one of those old like postcard images, and they used to send them back and forth between the between people, and it was like, you know, a man and a woman would send these postcards with pictures of themselves, and it reminds me of kind of those old school like 1920s style portraits. So if you wax nostalgic like I do about that period of time, you'll love this. If not, we'll go and try another preset here. So let me close that hint of color category, and I'll open up the 19th century processes, which again is another way to kind of wax nostalgic about a lot of these old vintage stylings. Calotype glass negative is one of my favorites. It works really well on wedding images. And you'll see another one of my favorites, let me scroll down a little bit more, are the tintype ones. We'll go ahead and click on tintype. And it's got this really cool tintype style border to it that can be really fun to play around with. Now for this image, I'm going to go down to the Hollywood portrait category. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but let me open it up in my quick view browser. So just an overcap of that quick view browser. There's an icon next to the right of every category. And once you click on that icon, it will pop up into your full screen view. And what's super cool about working with vertical style images is you get 3 straight across, and they're nice, really big previews. So like I can actually see what preset I'm going to actually like on this image. So I really like working with vertical images anyways, but this just solidifies why I like doing that. And you'll see any of the ones that have the flags filled in next to it means I've saved them as favorites, which is cool. So we've got Ambrose right here, which is a nice kind of romantic styling. Bogart has a little bit more grit to it, which I don't want. We've got Ingrid, these Ingrid portrait presets. These are probably going to be the ones that I want to use. They have a really soft, subtle glow to them. And then one of the other ones that's really nice is called Latte, and it's got kind of a coffee-stained style to it, but it also brightens up your image, and that's definitely not what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose Ingrid Warm. I want to warm up the photo. So we'll go ahead and click on that preset to apply it, and there we go. Now let me go ahead and close the left-hand side so I've got my full screen view here. On the right-hand side, we'll go ahead and start kind of the way that we did last time. We want to start with that tone pane. So I want to make some edits to brightness and contrast. So I may want to brighten up my image a little bit or darken it, depending on what I want to do. I can go in and edit things like contrast, blacks, whites, shadows, highlights, and so on. I'm going to take my detail slider and move that all the way to the left. I want absolutely no detail in this portrait image. Again, I want to create that kind of old school Hollywood glamour glow look to this. And if you add any universal detail, you can tell that everything starts to get a little bit crunchy, particularly in her skin. And she's a redhead, and she has a lot of very subtle freckles. So if I take that detail slider over, it's going to pump up a lot of those little imperfections that I like, but I want this to have that soft look to it. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to edit the glow that's on this image. So I'll open up my glow pane here, and it's already on. It has a soft light style glow to it. So it's technically a glow that's added with a specific style of blending mode. And I can go in and I can change that. We've got multiply, screen, all blend modes that you'll recognize. So I can take screen, and this is a lot closer to what I'm looking for. However, it's too strong. So if I take my amount, I can just lower that down a little bit to kind of soften it. And then I can also edit things like my halo amount, which if you move it over to the right, that halo is going to spread across and create an even more soft, glowy look to it. So I'm going to keep that halo down a little bit more so I can still have kind of an intense black in some of the darker areas here. Now I'm going to go back up to my tone pane, and I'm going to edit things like blacks. I want to make sure that my blacks are nice and tense. And I want to edit my contrast just a little bit to kind of pump up some of the areas that I want to add just a tiny bit more bright white, dark black contrast to. The next thing that we're going to do is go down, and I'm going to open up the toner pane. Now the toner pane, this has a customized toner to it. It has a red color that goes over the shadows, and then it has a warm kind of pinkish orangey color that goes over the highlights. Something that I realize a lot of people don't know about is you can always go in and change these colors and edit both the amount they're affecting your image and the balance of what's affecting your highlights and what's affecting your shadows. And this is an awesome way to customize a black and white image if you're a really big fan of toners. So I use toners all the time, and when you work a lot with weddings and couples and engagement shoots and portraits, and it's really, really popular nowadays for people to have kind of toned black and white images, and creating one that's very specific to your style is something that can really help your images quite a bit. And it also means that you can create kind of a customized toner that you can reuse again and again, which is also really great. So for this image, I'm going to go and I'm going to up the amount of the color in both the highlights and the shadows, and it's going to intensify both of those tones. And you'll see now it's getting a little bit more reddish in the hair, and it's getting a little bit more warm in her cheeks right here. And it's just by moving those amount sliders to the right. I can also go in and change the color of the highlight or the shadow toner. So if I click on that color swatch, I can go in and let's say I'm going to go over and I'm going to select my a different style of editing the color sliders. So I'm going to go and change to my RGB sliders, and I can make this color a little bit more yellow if I want to. So if I want to make it closer to kind of a yellow warm tone and less like a pinky tone, I can go in and I can change these sliders just a little bit. Go ahead and click OK, and we'll close that toner pane. Now, the next thing I need to do is I want to go in and make a couple other changes with my brushes. I want to add a little bit more contrast and detail to just a few of the areas in the image. Now, also before I do that, I also want to turn off my vignette. I forgot that there's a vignette that gets added with this, and I really don't like the way that it looks up in that top right-hand corner and left-hand corner. I think it looks really bad. So I'm just going to turn that pane off. You always have the option of changing the vignette if it's a little too harsh and turning the pane off. So always remember that you can go in and do that. A lot of times people forget that these panes turn on and off. So you always have the option of doing whatever you want with them. Now, let's go over to my brush tools, and I'm going to select one that we haven't used yet. It's called the contrast brush. And this goes in and it edits the contrast in selective areas of your image. So let me zoom back out and go up to the top of my image, and I want to increase the contrast in the area of her eyes. So I've got my amount set to 20, I've got my perfect brush on, and I'm just going to click and drag kind of over her eyes here. And you'll see it's intensifying her eyelashes, and it's also intensifying the whites of her eyes. And with that perfect brush on, I'm not too worried about it affecting too much of the image. I can also go in and do that in some of the other areas if I want to intensify the contrast in like her lips or her teeth. I can also do it pretty much anywhere else. Now, the next thing that I want to do, let me zoom back out, is I want to add a little bit of detail in here as well. So we lost a lot of detail, and because the detail slider is completely at 0, and then we added a glow to the image. And I want to go in and I want to add a little bit back into like the area where the hair is, and then also to her eyes. I want to make the eyes pop out a little bit more. So I'm going to raise my amount just a little bit so it's a bit more intense. And I'm just going to go in and click and drag over her eyes. And it's just crisping up those eyelashes there and the irises of her eyes. We don't have to worry too much about any of the other areas in the image. I can add detail to her eyebrows to kind of make those pop out a little bit more. And then let me make my brush a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to go over this area on the right-hand side where her hair is. And this just pops in a bit more contrast to some of those areas to kind of pump up the look of her hair. Now, the last thing that I may want to do is burn and dodge in certain areas. And this is something that usually takes a little bit of time, and I'm not going to go really into it for this because it can take quite a while if you're like me and you're very anal about burning and dodging. I like to do a lot of it because I really like to enhance certain features. So like for this image, I would probably go in and burn and dodge all of the highlights here to kind of intensify them. Because if I go in and I up the contrast too much in this image, this whole area is going to lose all of its detail. So by selectively burning and dodging my image, I can go in and I can choose which parts I want to lighten and darken and make them a little bit better. So I'm going to up my feather all the way to about 70, and I'm going to lower my amount down to about 5. And then I'll just go in, oops, I have it set to lighten. I'm going to swap my mode over to darken. And I just kind of like to click and paint over some of the areas that I want to go in and lighten and darken. And this can just kind of enhance some of the shadows and the highlights in your image without going overboard. So I always suggest burning and dodging because it can be so useful. And a lot of people don't do this with their images, but it can just kind of enhance certain parts. So go in and we'll just kind of dodge some of these areas down here. I can also go in, and one of the things I like to do is I like to darken up lip color just a little bit. Sometimes their lips get kind of light when you're editing images. So I like to go in and kind of pretend that they have a darker lip color on, and this can kind of just enhance their lips a little bit. So burning and dodging is usually the last thing that I'm going to do. Now, once again, I'll save this as a preset by going up to the preset menu, and we'll call this Soft Hollywood Glamour Look. I'll pop it in the portrait presets category, type in a creator and a description, and we'll go ahead and click on create. And now the next time I open up another image, which I'll show you how to do really quickly, let me go ahead and click apply, we can re-add that exact same preset. So we'll go ahead and click apply. Now when you're working in Photoshop, it adds a perfect black and white layer on top of your original image. So here's my original photo in color, and then here's my soft kind of glamour style black and white image. If you have another portrait that you want to add the same style to, on the right hand side in the perfect black and white pane, let me go down to my portrait presets category. I've got dramatic portrait preset, lavender cream portrait preset, and then I think I might have placed it in another category. But you can go in and you can use any of the presets in any of these categories, and you can apply presets from any of the different programs here as well. So if you want to, you can add an effects layer. So let me go into black and white and we'll open up portrait presets. There it is, soft Hollywood glamour look. So all I need to do is double click this and it's going to apply this preset to my image. So it'll open up black and white, do its little magic, apply all the different changes that I made, and then pop me straight back into Photoshop. And it applies it on a separate layer. So I've got my original image, and then here's my after image. I've got that really soft glow on her face, and I can now go in and get it ready to print, post on the web, or whatever it might be. All right, so it looks like it is about 3:50 right now, so I've been talking for quite a while. I'm going to start answering questions now. We've got about 10 minutes left in the webinar. So let me go ahead and just turn my mic off for just a second, grab a cup of water, and then I will come back and I'll just start going through as many questions as I can get to. There are a lot of people in this webinar. It looks like there's over 200. So I apologize in advance if I unfortunately don't get to your question, but I get through quite a bit in 10 minutes. So I promise I'll try and get to as many as I can. So let me turn my mic off and I'll be back in just a second. All right, so looks like we've got a whole bunch of questions here. We've got over 30 questions. So again, I'll try and get through as many as I can. So there's a question, you use contrast around the eyes. Can you selectively sharpen with any of the brushes? The closest you can get to sharpening in certain areas is by using that detail brush. It's not exactly sharpening. That's not typically what we call it, but it's very close to sharpening. So if you want to add selective detail in a certain area, you would use that detail brush, and that's typically what you're going to do. Now, if you want to selectively sharpen an image overall, you're going to want to use a different program. You're going to want to go into, typically when I selectively sharpen, I go through Photoshop. So I'll add a sharpening layer and then create a mask and then go through and edit it out. You can also do that in layers as well. So if you want to add a sharpening effects layer and then pop it into Perfect Layers, you can also selectively sharpen that way too. So if you don't have Photoshop, you can always do it through Perfect Layers, which is really useful. Can you export from black and white directly to Perfect Portrait and vice versa? Yes, you can. When you're working with Lightroom, so let me pop over this image to Lightroom. If I go up to my File menu and go down to Plugin Extras, you'll notice that I can go straight to the Perfect Photo Suite here, and this allows me to access multiple modules at once. So if I wanted to take this image into Perfect Portrait first and then go into Perfect Black and White, which is how I would recommend you do that process, you can select Perfect Portrait and then you'll have a module selector in the top right hand corner, kind of like you do in Lightroom, and you can click through whichever module you want to go to next. So that's a good way of using multiple things together. That can be really helpful. All right. How do I ensure that my image result will return to Lightroom after editing in black and white? By doing the same process that I just did. So by right-clicking your image, going to Edit In, and choosing Perfect Black and White. This pop-up menu right here, make sure that the first option is Edit a Copy with Lightroom Adjustments, and that's usually what will be checked automatically. So this always ensures that you will have a copy And when you go ahead and click apply in Perfect Black and White, it will automatically pop back into Lightroom the way that it did with this Seattle photo. So this went straight back into Lightroom for me. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to go into another program to save it. It just copied over, created another image, and that was going to be my black and white photo. So as long as you go through that same process that I went through, you'll always be able to do that. All right. Is the brushwork that you did not saved in a preset? Like when I brought out the detail in the lips or darkening, detail in the eyes or darkening the lips. Yes, so the brush changes that I made with the brightness brush, the contrast brush, and with the detail brush are not saved in a preset. And the reason why is because every image is going to be different. So if you have to go through and completely erase all of the brush changes and then reapply them, that can be really frustrating, especially if you're working with multiple images and you want to go in and do some quick edits. You don't have to erase all of your work. So we save the presets without any brush changes so that you can individually choose which parts of your image you want those changes to be applied to. And when I'm working with a lot of images, particularly portraits, if I'm working with a lot of portraits, every single image you're going to want to burn and dodge or adjust separately. In this photo, her eyes are in a different spot. The areas that I would burn and dodge are in a different spot. And so I want to go in and choose which parts of the image I get to do that with. All right. So hopefully I just answered this, but when applying your presets, how do you control brush application from one image to the next? That's, if you want to go in and add brush changes, you will have to go through Perfect Black and White, but you can apply your preset, add your brush changes, and then apply it and get it out into Photoshop, Lightroom, Aperture, or wherever you might be. So that's usually a really good way to do that. All right. Okay, so looks like we had a whole bunch of questions about people who wanted to know all about those brush presets. So if you burn and dodge, it won't be copied over to another image. With the preview mode, can you use the black and white image created when you import into the program instead of the color image? I don't believe you can. I believe the preview will always be your original color photo. If you want to see your original color image, your original just grayscale image, and then your new black and white image, I don't believe we have a way for you to do that. The preview mode is always going to be in color and not going to have access to that zeroed out, very simple black and white edit. All right. When you do cosmetic retouching in your work, when do you do cosmetic retouching in your workflow when doing portraits? Both of these portraits that I used today, I already added some pretty basic retouching to them. All I had to do was go in and kind of soften some of the blemishes and then remove a couple spots. I always do that before black and white. So the first thing that I would do with one of these images is apply my retouching. Then I would apply my basic changes. So, you know, exposure, contrast, detail, clarity, vibrance, and so on. I would apply those changes, and then I would go into black and white or effects, and then I would go into resize to get it ready to print. So that's typically what I do. Always do your retouching before you apply your effects. That's definitely what you want to do. It looks like there were a whole bunch of questions about whether this is recorded. Yes, it was. So we're being recorded right now. So you'll be able to rewatch this webinar. You have to convert the recording to something that can be viewed. So I'll convert the recording today, and then we'll probably get it up tomorrow. So it takes a little while for it to render, and then it takes a little while for it to get up online. So you'll be able to go in and rewatch this again tomorrow. So if you guys missed anything, you'll always have the option of doing that. Can you retain color in black and white images? And if so, can you use the image? Can you use the image of the kid with the cap and the eyes? Let me show you how to do that really quickly. So we'll go back to Lightroom. We've got this image right here. Let me go to Perfect Black and White. We'll apply a pretty basic preset. All right, so inside black and white, let me go ahead and add an effect, and then I'll show you how to do that. So let's do, this is portrait presets. I'll add my lavender cream portrait preset. So once you apply something to your image, you want to bring back the color. We have something called the selective color brush, and this allows you to bring back the original color information from your photo. So let me zoom in just a little bit, and we'll go in and we'll just click and paint over his eyes, and we'll bring back the color in his eyes. I'm going to turn the Perfect brush off so I don't have to worry about this, and we're just going to go in, and you would spend a lot more time on this if you were doing this for, a client or somebody, but you can click and drag. You have access to the Perfect brush with this, so you can be really exact, which is nice. I'm just doing a really, really quick edit here so you guys can actually see how this works. And we'll click and drag, and then let me zoom out. And now we've got partial color brought back. So it's something called the selective color brush. It's on the left-hand side in your toolbar. You can change the opacity of the brush, and you can use the Perfect brush as well as editing basics, like you can paint in and paint out if you make mistakes. You can change the size and the feather amount. So that's all with the selective color brush. All right. Let's see. Lightning brushing, does the lighten brush in the lower right hand corner that I used in the Space Needle shot, does it not affect the vignette? No, it does not. So when I lighten a certain part of my image, the vignette goes on top of whatever changes I make. So that vignette is always going to be the same, which personally I like because the vignette I always add last. So I want to make sure my image looks perfect. And then I add my vignette, I add my border, and then I add my sharpening. That's typically how it goes. If I add a vignette, if I add, a border. So those changes will be separate from your vignette. Your vignette is kind of like a vignette layer that goes on top of your image. In the first image, the Space Needle, was it shot in HDR? Is it just one image? That is just one image. So I shot that in one go. It's just a long exposure. So I'm much more of a portrait photographer. I don't shoot a lot of landscapes, so this is kind of my first time and my first go with shooting night photos. But luckily, I was with a very good photographer who does do that all the time. I'm not as well versed in HDR and landscape photography as I am with portrait photography. So this was kind of a new thing for me, and it's a one-shot long exposure. All right. There was another question, how to add a border on the outside rather than the inside of the photo. You wouldn't do that in perfect black and white. So the way borders work in perfect black and white, you add the border on the inside of your photo. If you want to add a border on the outside, you have to increase your canvas size and then apply a border. And that's something that would be a lot easier to do in a program like Photoshop. You can also do that in perfect layers if you want to, but it does eat into the center of your image. Would you tweak the perspective of your image in Lightroom before loading it into On One? Yes. Although I don't tweak my exposure very much. I think I'm a purist. I don't like to change my exposure very much. I'm very, very particular about my landscapes. So if you are going to edit your perspective and crop your image, you would probably do that before you go into perfect black and white. That's typically the workflow that you would do. So for this image, if I wanted to go over to my develop module and change that keystoning just a little bit, or if I want to straighten it out a little bit or crop it, I would do that before I go into perfect black and white. All right, let's see what else is in here. All right, so it looks like there were a couple questions in here about whether the suite is going to work with the Creative Cloud and how that's going to work. And looks like there's at least 3 or 4 questions in here that are all about that. So as of right now, because the Creative Cloud is still, it's not 100%. And if you have the Creative Cloud and you're going to be working towards getting it, you're going to be just fine. We're going to make sure that we work with the Creative Cloud. Now, something that happens in between when you upload the Creative Cloud, and this has happened with previous versions of Photoshop and Lightroom and Aperture, is sometimes when you upload a new software, like you upload the new Creative Cloud or you upload Lightroom 5. For some reason, every once in a while, we get someone who calls in and says that the plugin didn't automatically copy over. We do work with the Creative Cloud We work with Lightroom 5. We will work with whatever new version of Elements comes out, whatever new version of Aperture comes out, and so on. So if it doesn't automatically upload, you can always deinstall your software and then reinstall it. You can also call us, and we can also help you load up the suite as plugins individual, because sometimes that is a problem. So as of right now, we don't really know whether there are any. We haven't heard of any serious problems between 7.5 and the Creative Cloud. So if you can't locate some of your plugin files, send us an email or call us, and we can walk you through the steps to be able to reload those plugin files. Sometimes it just happens when you upload new software, the On1 suite doesn't always re-upload into the new software. And with so much software changing so often, it's really hard to constantly be able to update with every single software. But we do work 100%. You're good to go if you use the Creative Cloud. You're good to go if you use Lightroom 5. Whatever the newest version of Aperture is, I think it's 4, and Photoshop Elements 11. So we work with all those different programs. Sometimes there are a couple of difficulties in between the installation process and making it work, but it does work just fine. All right, so it looks like, so it's after 4 o'clock, and unfortunately I have to go. These webinars always run a lot later than I think they're going to. Thank you guys so much for showing up today. If you have any more questions, please contact us. We have fantastic customer support. So give us a call, send us an email, let us know what's going on. Also, we have some amazing webinars lined up for the next 2 weeks. I'll be posting those today. So we've got some for the rest of the week, and the next week we've got a whole bunch of new ones, including a basic portrait editing one and an advanced Perfect Effects webinar, which will be really fun. So go ahead and take a look at the schedule, sign up for some new webinars, because we'd love to see you guys again. So thanks again for showing up today, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful afternoon or evening.